Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Monday, June 23rd, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David. Good morning.
Good morning, Jessica.
Morning. It is day 626 of the war. Sirens just ran across most of Israel this morning, just about 15 minutes ago. In our headlines right now, we have U.S. President Donald Trump floating the idea of a Tehran regime change, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said last night in a pre-recorded press conference that Israel will avoid a, quote, war of attrition. The U.S. is also warning its citizens of a heightened threat. We will talk about all of those issues, what we're hearing from the U.S., what we're hearing here. Skies opening up a little bit for flights out of Israel, just a tad, Iran and Russia, and more of that, so stay with us.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation for humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
Let's start with the statement by President Donald Trump. Talking, tweets obviously about the possibility of a regime change, about the obliteration, that's his word, of the Iranian threat. Given everything that's been happening in this now 10 days of this, what's your take on all of it, David?
Well, it's not clear how much damage the American strikes did. It is very clear from what the head of the Joint Chiefs described as the initial damage report that considerable damage was done at Natanz and Isfahan. And apparently Fordo, there's a limit to what anybody can tell at the moment, but I assume we'll have more definitive information. There was the use of the word obliteration, both by the president and by the Secretary of Defense. I think the defense secretary even spoke of the complete obliteration of the Iranian nuclear program. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the case, but I think the American belief is that they've done immense damage. And let's say this: the position of the president and the demand or the requirement, as far as Israel is concerned, is that Iran's program be dismantled. And we've heard the National Security Advisor, Tzachi Hanegbi, at the very beginning of this conflict saying, we don't think that we can destroy all of this in motion, if you like, as in by the Air Force and even with American bombing. The effort has to be that the regime in Iran becomes convinced that its survival is at stake, that its own interests are served by it, or it's dismantling its own program, abandoning its nuclear weapons drive, or somebody else coming in, American supervision, and doing it for them. That's something that the Iranian regime is giving no sign of wanting to do.
Right.
So however badly it is battered and however many key commanders have been lost and key scientists have been lost and all the elements of the nuclear program that have been targeted and the ballistic missile program that is also seen really as an existential threat, and we can understand why. If Iran was attempting to triple the number of ballistic missiles that it was producing and trying to create an arsenal of thousands upon thousands of one-ton warhead-carrying missiles, which is what we're dealing with, why that would be considered to be a strategic threat as well, and a potential existential threat as well. So despite all of its efforts being really battered to a staggering degree from that very first opening salvo by Israel through many, many days of Israeli attacks, an air corridor, as we've discussed, all the way from Israel to, broadly speaking, much of Iran. Israel's also operating in the most distant parts of Iran, and now the Americans getting involved despite all of that, and Khamenei being in a bunker and naming his successors, etc., etc. In the last few hours and the last day since the American strike, you have not had an Iran saying, "Hey, this is terrible. We need to negotiate, and
Right.
we're ready to
Let's come to the
compromise." Quite the
table.
reverse.
Right.
Quite the reverse. Threats against they're not. I mean, the threats are not specific, and we haven't seen action. But threats against American targets, for example, Iranian officials saying American forces in the Middle East are legitimate targets, and so on. You would think that would be incredibly counterproductive from Iran, that if they threaten and if they were, heaven forbid, to start trying to attack American targets in the Middle East or anywhere else, that this would simply bring the Americans deeper into this conflict. Maybe they think that's a good idea. I can't imagine that that is a good idea for Iran. So the bottom line is you've got a very battered regime, which is telling its own public a very different story as best as it can, with Israel and others intervening in their state broadcasts and so on. And you've got, as you said at the beginning there, for the first time a few hours ago, the president of the United States talking about regime change in Iran. Now, that's striking. Hours earlier, every American official was taking pains to stress that this was not about regime change.
Mm-hmm.
The defense secretary spoke about this being an intentionally limited American attack only on nuclear capabilities. This is not about regime change. Iran should now negotiate. Our goal is to make sure they cannot attain nuclear weapons. And then you've got the president saying, well, actually, maybe regime change is quite a good idea, right? And that's how things are with Trump. We'll see what happens. We'll give them a couple of weeks. Nobody knows what I'm going to do. And in the case of the American attack, nobody did know what he was going to do.
Right.
And they carried out the attack with all the decoy efforts of sending B-2 bombers off in a different direction, which everyone thought meant maybe they were gearing up, when in fact the actual
And
B-2
saying
bombers...
2 weeks, right? Also the 2-week comment.
Sure. So I don't know what I would make of this. I think if I was the Iranian regime, and I think this is part of Trump's particular genius, that I would be pretty worried by this. Is he serious about this? What's he going to do next? Now, again, you've got a very patient, entrenched regime. It is not going to give up
So
easily. The supreme leader will hang in there as long as he can. He's already making plans for his replacement if he's unable to continue. This is not a leadership that is ready to give up easily. And of course, the potential is for even more hardline figures to assume command. I mean, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is incredibly powerful in Iran, which has sustained immense blows to its key leadership. Nonetheless, they're not about compromise. These are adamant, very extreme, very ruthless, an organization that has proved entirely capable of indifferently quashing opposition within Iran. So all I think one would say in the last few hours that one wouldn't have said before is that the stakes seem to be a little bit higher, that the president of the United States has now put regime change on the table one way or another. Does he mean it? How much does he mean it? How serious is it? And that's something else that the Iranian leadership will now have to take into account as it weighs what to do.
Okay, let's turn to Netanyahu's comments yesterday in this pre-recorded video. He brought out this term war of attrition, which is, of course, what Israelis are very afraid of, that this is just going to go on and on without an end. Weeks, months, who knows? So what was your takeaway from his statement? What do you think he was trying to say?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think it was obviously, as all these appearances are very, very interesting, it's worth noting that this was a press conference. In other words, he took questions. My understanding is the questions he knew what he was going to be asked. Nonetheless, he was open to questions. He made a short introductory statement. His reference to a war of attrition was in answer to a question. Someone asked him, are you concerned that Israel might be dragged into a war of attrition? In other words, that Iran will basically keep firing and manage to keep firing, and Israel will have this long diet of terrible missile attacks with greater and lesser damage. We've seen fatalities. We're essentially, you and I are speaking after about a half an hour of ongoing little barrages of missiles in the north, the center, and the south of Israel. Is this to be the new normal? Netanyahu was pretty adamant that he does not. I think it's clear that he said we're not going to get into it, and the reason he thinks we're not going to get into it is because Israel is gradually destroying an ever-growing proportion of their missile launchers. And again, this is very early now, so you've seen a slightly different mode of action from the Iranians this morning, in that they've been firing not very many missiles every now and again.
Right. What does that mean?
Let's speculate that it means that they know that if they hang around in the open in any kind of context for any length of time, Israel has so much air supremacy now that they're basically risking the destruction of everything they fire from. So maybe they're trying to do this very, very quickly, wherever they can pop in and pop out. I think Netanyahu said something like half of the missile launchers were destroyed. That's the bottleneck. It's less the number of rockets than the number of missiles, and more the launchers.
Launchers.
So I think Netanyahu is pretty confident about that. I think it was also very interesting, and we'll see, by the way, of course, we'll see if this is to be the case. I think it was very interesting that he said he has some ideas about where Iran's stocks of 60% enriched uranium are. I think that's really, really important. That's the second thing he said where he hasn't finished the sentence, if you like. A few days ago, he said something about, they're having problems with their drones, and he didn't elaborate.
What that
and
meant.
Striking that, hundreds upon hundreds of drones have been launched at Israel with, there was a home smashed to pieces in Bet Shan on the weekend. But considering how potent these drones are, I mean, they're precision weapons, and they carry a sizable amount of explosives. Nothing in the order of the missiles, but still they can do tremendous damage, and they've been fairly marginal. So we don't quite know what Israel has managed to do where their drones are concerned. And on the uranium, I mean, this is crucial. And very, very unclear messages coming from the UN watchdog. In other words, I wanted to stress this because it's been nagging away at me. There was an interview with Rafael Grossi, who is the head of the UN watchdog, the IAEA, late last week, in which he was reported to have said that the IAEA has lost track of the Iranian enriched uranium. That's not exactly what he said if you watch the interview. He said, in principle, it's safely at Isfahan. He just doesn't know how safe anything is. And beyond that, he really can't verify anything now because there's a war on. That's not quite the same as saying we've lost track of it, but it may not be a million miles away from that. I've heard Iranian people saying we know exactly where it is and we've moved it and it's, in a safe place, or at least some of it is.
I mean, you have to imagine it is, right? They haven't put all this work into it to lose track of it.
They may. We're being speculative now. So we know that they had potentially vulnerable nuclear facilities. Natanz is the main enrichment center. American and Israeli assessments are that it has been essentially destroyed. The Americans also hit Isfahan. Israel has hit Isfahan. Did they leave it there, which is where we thought it was being stored, or had they moved at least some of it to Fordow or somewhere else? Because if you're in the very final stages, you may not need the largest facility or even the most secure facility because you are trying to weaponize, pushing towards a bomb. So I would certainly not be sanguine or complacent about any of this. Even if lots of the stockpiles whereabouts are known and there's a little that isn't, a relative little, that's problematic. We don't know how badly Fordow has been damaged, and we also don't know about what might be potentially smaller facilities. So Netanyahu was sounding really quite strikingly confident on that issue, but was not giving away too many details. I think that's something we need to be very wary of and watchful of.
Okay. All right. So thanks for that, David. We're going to take a quick break. When we're back, we'll deal with some more of the related issues. So stay with us.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
Let's talk about Iran and Russia. Had headlines about communication there. It's no big surprise that Russia is a, I don't know, colleague, supporter of Iran. Or what do you take of what do you take of what we're seeing there? What could that portend in terms of the geopolitical relationships?
Well, I think that Iran has been, I don't know if they've been dismayed, but the fact is they have not been supported in any practical way, I think, by anybody. Again, I would warn against hubris. Netanyahu was asked about, what about Korea providing Iran with nuclear warheads or something? And he said, we don't, I'm not going to get into any of the specifics, but we're watching all kinds of things. Believe me, we're sort of looking carefully. But in terms of what we know, Hezbollah has certainly not piled in. Hamas is fighting its ongoing awful hostage-holding battle against Israel, but nobody, not China, not overtly Korea, and not Russia, nobody has rushed to the defense of Iran in any practical way. Diplomatically and in terms of trying to use leverage and so on, yes, the Iranians are in touch with, traveling to Russia. Putin does not want to see the people with, or the regimes with which he is aligned, essentially collapsing under American pressure. I mean, what you've got here is an assertion of American power, and carried out in a way that caught everybody on the wrong foot. So unexpected and effective, and pretty troubling, you would think, directly for Iran, but also for those like Putin, like Russia, that are essentially siding with them. So this is Iran attempting to use Russia's diplomatic clout and potential for causing harm. We'll see how that plays out. We're in an era now, as of the last couple of days, where an America that was perceived to be disengaging from the Middle East, a president who was adamant about domestic American priorities, certainly, who came into office saying he's going to stop wars, not start them. Catching everybody, like I said, on the wrong foot, with we assume things are always going to go right, but they don't always go right, including with American military interventions in this region, notably including with Iran in years past. So they carried out this attack. They caught everybody by surprise. It was certainly effective. We don't know exactly how effective. This is a major blow, again, not just to Iran, but to others who are pushing and shoving and seeking leverage and influence. And, in a region where Syria, for example, now is less obviously under Russia's sway, to put it mildly, with the leadership embraced by President Trump, of whom Israel is pretty wary. But still, a leadership that is saying it is not seeking violent conflict with Israel. So Iran is reaching out to Russia in a situation of weakness, with that whole alliance emphatically on the back foot.
David, just to stay with that for a moment, in speaking with a hostage parent last night, he was saying to me, Ruby Chen, the father of Itai Chen, a soldier who was killed on the 7th and his body taken hostage to Gaza and still there. He was saying to me how, it's just opportunity. When there's change, there is opportunity. And that's how he and other families are looking at this moment. Of course, it really remains to be seen because, as we know, the fighting in Gaza continues, as you just said. But do we think, is it too early to say that? Do we think at this point that change is opportunity?
Well, the person who's leading this war on Israel's part, the prime minister, said last night in that press conference that he does think that the gradual defanging of Iran is emphatically beneficial in terms of the war in Gaza and in terms of the effort to return living hostages and secure the return of those who have been slain, because Hamas is increasingly isolated, because Iran has not rallied to Hamas's defense lately because it's got its own preoccupation. I mean, there are specific things that the key Iranian official who was responsible for coordination with Hamas, who was certainly in on October the 7th ahead of time, was eliminated by Israel at the weekend. That's a very senior, significant figure. You know, the key person coordinating between those two entities, between the patron Iran and the proxy, the potent
Hamas,
proxy
right?
Hamas. You know, if you want to just have I don't think this is necessarily how all Israelis would see it, but it was interesting that Aryeh Deri, who's the head of the Shas party, who is not a minister, but who has been involved in all of the high-level forums that have discussed key decisions in this conflict, as far as we know, is one of the very few people who knew ahead of time
That this.
pretty much everything about this conflict as it has played out. Aryeh Deri said in an interview, I think we had a little short item on it overnight. I don't want to misquote him, but basically he was, and he said this before, but less dramatically, about October the 7th being somehow salvation for Israel. That's not the word he used, so please look up exactly what he said. But his point was that, terrible though it was, the single worst day in terms of deaths for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, it allowed Israel to belatedly internalize what was being planned for it. And since then, Israel has fought back, and Hamas is, massively degraded. Hezbollah is not involved in this conflict, and we are now tackling Iran. That's a very I don't know what to say, pragmatic, cold way of looking at it. Although,
Right.
he put it in
Prayerful.
different terms. You
Right.
can understand to some extent where he is coming from, because, and I wrote this last week, just imagine if Hamas had coordinated fully with Iran and with Hezbollah. We don't know why the timing was such, but if you look at what Iran was able to fire at Israel, if you look at what Iran would have been able to fire at Israel if it hadn't been so massively targeted in those first few hours, if you look at what Hezbollah could have done, you have to say that if Hamas had coordinated October the 7th,
Right.
it's unthinkable. So will the reverse now prove to be the case? In other words, that as Israel is, with American support, gradually taking apart the Iran-led axis of evil, will this yield a breakthrough in Gaza? Again, you're dealing with a death cult terrorist government in Gaza that has shown no sign of anything other than brutality and cynicism and pragmatism. And therefore, nobody is getting carried away here. But it's certainly a credible argument to make that the more all the elements of this axis are under pressure, the more likely it is that something potentially will shift in a constructive way as far as the hostages are concerned.
Okay, one last thing. Domestically, Israelis trying to return home, Israelis trying to go out. The skies are definitely not fully open. The airport is not fully open. Where do we think this is moving over the next days, really? Because every day is very much a new story.
Yeah, every day and even every hour. I mean, again, we're speaking in the context. I think even while we were talking, there was another siren in the north. We're at our microphones because our areas were not siren, so we're not being
hearing it. Yeah,
we're being responsible people. Sorry, just
I'm in my mamad. I'm in my safe room. Go on.
Right.
Sorry.
So at the start of when Israel launched the attacks on Iran, there were something like 150 to 200,000 Israelis abroad. I think maybe the more credible figure is around 150,000, of whom maybe 50,000 have managed to find their way back one way or another. What's interesting is that a lot of them have come back over the land crossings, especially I think from Jordan and especially from Aqaba in southern Jordan. And this was despite, as far as I understood, that the National Security Council had told Israelis not to come back via Jordan and Egypt. Maybe Aqaba is a special case because the transportation ministry or the minister, Miri Regev, was saying that, hey, we've set up shuttles from the Aqaba Eilat area border crossing. Well, why would you be doing that if Israelis aren't supposed to be coming back that way? But apparently they kind of are. So a lot of people, I think maybe something like 39,000 as of the last number, had come back via the land crossings. I think a lot of them from Jordan. And then we've had the what are sometimes called rescue flights, which is, I mean,
odd term.
it's an like you'd think that your country's been missiled and you're on holiday in, I don't know, Greece or Italy, you're not going to be desperate to come home. But hey, this is Israelis, and of course we are desperate to come home, being rescued from Rome to come back to missile attacks from Iran. That's the reality. And then these flights are now in the last 2-3 days. Certainly, there's more of the flights than there were. Took a long time to get this going. They suspend them. I'm sure the airport is, if it's not closed now, it was until the last couple of minutes. I suspect it might even be closed now as we speak. Okay, so they turn back in several cases, or they hang around outside Israeli airspace where it's deemed to be safe, and so on. We've had people coming back on ships, on yachts, or anything
on
that
tugboats.
Yeah.
Yep.
So whatever, I assume there's very close coordination with the air defense people, that they know where vessels are. But basically, gradually, sometimes a little more speedily, Israelis are finding ways to get back home.
Yep. Okay. We wish everyone safe travels and safe skies and not too much time in safe rooms and shelters. For now, right? That's what we're hoping for. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Jessica. Everyone should take care.
Absolutely. And thank you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Tomas Gersh. Take care. Be well. We'll see you soon.